As creatives, whether we're making our art or in some way just shaping, the life that we want to live, it seems like anxiety and depression often feel like a part of that journey. I'm curious, how do you see the relationship between anxiety, depression, and creativity?
Well, it's a very interesting question. And I think that's kind of an unfolding mystery because it operates in different ways in different people in different parts of their lives under different circumstances. So I think in general, it's fair to say that, we start out as a tiny, defenseless creature and learn early on that the world is big and we're not, and it's powerful and we're not, and we have to find ways of coping with that discrepancy for the next few decades, hopefully. And so there's a certain element of anxiety that rises out of the general human insecurity, call it existential anxiety if you wish. To that, people have other life circumstances that undermine their sense of continuity or security or dependability of the world around them and so forth. So when there is change or interruption in their normal comfort zone, they're naturally going to feel anxiety. So anxiety itself is not pathological. It's a recognition that life is forever changing and it's not always our friend, of course. So it's a kind of early alert system. Depression also is a natural phenomenon because there are aspects of our life in response to people around us, circumstances around us, our own timidity and so forth, that wind up suppressing and perhaps oppressing elements of our natural life that wishes expression in the world. So, depression itself can be a natural byproduct of aspects of one's life energy that are not being valued or exercised in some way. So I want to, for the moment, depathologize the pathology here, and then go on to say where it becomes pathological is when we start looking at the question, well, what does that make me do? What does that anxiety make me do or keep me from doing? Then there's a genuine invitation to our engagement and our investigation. Or what is that depression about? Why has the psyche autonomously withdrawn its approval and support over the energies and the venues I wish to explore? And that's a humbling experience, to be sure. But I've often said to people, in real life, you often have to choose between anxiety and depression. Anxiety comes when you move into new territory because the psyche is not in control there and has to open itself to other possibilities. But if you shut that down, which is our essential creative nature, you're going to have depression as a result of that. And so if push comes to shove, choose anxiety because at least it's an expanding world. It's a world of discovery. It's a world of development. And depression ultimately leads one to stagnation and to self-medication or living a life of distraction or avoidance or whatever, none of which is a very healthy way to live. Life is difficult, and one still has to make the best of it with the tools that we have. So, we shouldn't feel anxious about being anxious, and we shouldn't feel depressed about being depressed. We have to recognize these are natural phenomena, but there are ways in which we can bring consciousness to bear on that and address these issues. What is asking for expression through me is not a question that we often ask ourselves. Because early on, given that, dependence of a child, we have to say, what does the world want of me? What do my parents want of me? What does the school teacher want of me, et cetera, et cetera. And we overlearn that message and ignore the fact that there's something in us that's seeking its expression in the world through us. And that's not about ego gratification. That also can lead to a life of privation, suffering, and certainly great effort to bring forth what is wanting to come through us into the world. And so there's a place here for consciousness, which is why you and I are having this conversation today. So long-winded response to your question, but I think it's a good question because we live on a daily basis, cycling between depression and anxiety. And, sometimes out of that tension comes our best effort too, ironically.
Yeah. In one of your books, you've described fear and lethargy as kind of these like gremlins, which are sitting at the foot of our bed in some way, kind of greeting us every morning. And I feel like for creatives, they kind of often turn into, I guess, procrastination, maybe self-doubt, maybe even self-sabotage. I mean, these are kind of the terms that kind of we discuss a lot today. So how do we actually face or keep facing those gremlins?
Well, ultimately, it has to do with courage. You have to show up every day as best you can. And yes, no matter what you did yesterday, at the foot of your bed this morning, and they'll be there again tomorrow morning, our fear, that's the part in us that says, the world's too big. It's too threatening. I can't handle all that stress. And the other part says, chill out, have some chocolate, turn on the television. Tomorrow's another day. And as long as they prevail, you fritter your life away. You wind up coulda, woulda, shoulda. You wind up saying, well, I always wanted to do this. I always wanted to write that novel, or I always wanted to take a course in painting or whatever. And, but you didn't do it, did you? What is it that kept? Well, I was busy, or the kids were there, or I couldn't afford it. All of which may be factually the case, but also are excuses to avoid stepping into the largeness of your own journey. Jung said our biggest shadow issue is not that we're evil, though we can be. He said we live too small a life. And he said we all walk in shoes too small for us. So I think that's the intimidating factors of life play a large role in shutting down the creative process. And when we realize that that's inside of us, it doesn't matter. You could say, well, I'm going to move to Venice and be inspired there, or Seattle, and things will take it. Well, the geographic solution might be helpful, but often it proves not to be the case because we carry with us these inherent limitations. So it requires stepping into your life even when you do it in the presence of uncertainty. Jung said once, this work of becoming yourself as a full being, he said, consists of 3 parts, of which psychology can only help with the first part, which is to give insight. He said, then come the moral qualities of the individual. Second, he said, is courage to face what life brings to you. And thirdly, to endure, to stick it out over time. And that requires patience, courage, fortitude, consistency, and discipline. I love to quote, because I find it so resonant for me, the late painter Chuck Close's observations about his creative process. He said, amateurs wait for inspiration. He said, the rest of us show up at the studio early and get to work. And that's what it comes down to. Unless you're willing to pay your dues, unless you're willing to show up and open yourself and stick it out in a consistent way, nothing's going to happen. And when you find that out, you realize, well, this is a kind of moral challenge, isn't it? Is my life going to be purposeful? Am I going to find what is meaningful for me in this life? Or am I going to try to find the easy way, which is understandable? But then at the end of the journey, will you feel that you lived your life or not? That's the question. That's why Jung said these are moral qualities to be addressed within the individual.
Yeah. So how do we in some way kind of discern, that, I guess, summons that we have for this larger life, but at the same time, we do have all these, let's say, obligations or all this legacy we got growing up, because I think a lot of us find ourselves very much kind of torn between the two, or often actually kind of more regressive in some way. So how do you reconcile those two tensions?
Well, sometimes people have said to me, do you think I should do this or do that? And I'd say, yes. You have to do both. Find out a way to do both. So Almost 100%. My day job is a psychotherapist, and I've been doing that now for many, many decades. And before that, I was a university teacher. And, you know, that's what pays the bills. And almost all my books have been written. I don't get sabbaticals. The day I don't get sabbaticals, the day I don't put food on the table. So my writing usually is between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock at night. You know, I work during the day. I have dinner with my wife. I watch the news, and then I go to work. And you know, I'm not a workaholic. I just know that that's the only way I can honor what is apparently seeking expression through me. And that's the question. You know, are you willing to pay the dues? And that means that if you sit down and you address that big empty canvas or that screen that you're working with, or the tube that's staring back at you in the computer, and that's where the battle is. And a lot of folks just don't want to deal with that, and therefore nihil ex nihil fit. You know, nothing comes from nothing. So that's where the creative process shuts down. And I want to add, by the way, we're all creative. You know, the creativity is not so much an act of will as it is opening oneself to the dynamics of the unconscious. When I want to address a new topic, I sort of put it in there. Now, that's just my metaphor for saying I want to let it brew for a while. And when I say put it in there, I do make this physical gesture that it's like you move from outside your body into the solar plexus somehow. And ask the little people in there to work on it. I have this fantasy, there are a bunch of little people running around looking for files and things like that, you know, and that's where the draft tables are, you know. So they work on it. And what I've learned through the years, and I really believe this, if you put something in there, a problem to address, or some creative task, they work on it. I want to personify it. They work on it, and they'll get back to you. It may come as a dream in 72 hours. It may be an insight you have over the weekend as you're driving on a highway, or you wake at 3 a.m, the hour of the wolf, and there it is staring you in the face, whether it's a domestic issue or a creative issue or a professional issue or whatever. And, you know, we can't force that. But on the other hand, most people never really open to that either. And, you know, our intellect, our consciousness can certainly do an awful lot. But, you know, the ancients made a distinction clearly between art and technique, for example. Techne was skill. You know, you can use creative process and your intelligence and your knowledge to shape things. That's what editors do, for example. And the artist knows that color is off a little bit. I have to experiment over here. That's the proper use of consciousness. But the genuine impulse to create comes from within us. And one illustration of that that's so obvious we would forget it is our dreams. Sleep research tells us that 6 dreams per night in a normal life sleep cycle. And that's a lot of productivity. Even if we pay no attention to it, it's clear the psyche has purposeful activity going on. It's probably processing the massive stimuli that come to us in the course of any given day. But on the other hand, it also, if you pay attention over time, is soliciting some kind of dialogue with consciousness. And if you do pay attention, you realize there's something inside of each of us. And this is something we need to understand. There's something inside of each of us that knows what's right for us. There's something inside of us that knows what's best for us. It may or may not coincide with what consciously would make us most comfortable or make us popular in our neighborhood or acceptable to our family. But it is in some way, in a non-narcissistic way, our summons to accountability. I say non-narcissistically because the ego's natural narcissistic agenda is, well, I want to be in control of my life. I want it to flow smoothly and pleasantly. conflict free. I want to get along with everybody. I want to be happy, whatever that means. But, life has other plans. And so the real question then is what is wishing, a standpoint from you, or a perspective from you, or some investment of energy and of value that may or may not coincide with those external goals. And you have an internal conflict. And, as we all know, there are times in cultural life, in history, where people with certain talents are suppressed because they are not acceptable or considered worthwhile, or issues of slavery or class structure or economic hardship that play such a diminishing role in people's lives. And so that creative impulse that every person has to some degree, and by that I don't necessarily mean you have to be an artist, of course. I'm talking about how you approach your life and how you open to developmental possibilities. That's something that is within us, and that's a challenge on a daily basis for each of us.
You just mentioned that, dreams are in some way a way of communicating with our unconscious. So, I think for creatives that, and some are perhaps more mindful of that, it does sound like a very nice way to kind of tap into our imagination. At the same time, for me, it feels like culturally, at least today, dreams are kind of maybe put a bit more on the side. Maybe they're even hard to decode, or they even just seem like more random, like not valuable. But it seems like you put an emphasis on dreams as one of the kind of tools to kind of connect with that inner spirit, let's say. So how do you approach dreams or working with dreams?
When we work with dreams, we have to respect that there is some image-making power within each of us that lies outside of conscious control. So, for example, you cannot order up a certain kind of dream. You might say, I want to dream of having a certain meal or climbing a certain mountain this evening. The psyche is not going to pay attention to you. It'll say what it has to say, has its own autonomy. So there's some independent agency that we have to acknowledge there. And of course, the problem with the unconscious is it's unconscious. So we can only begin to address it consciously when it takes some form. And a dream is one of those forms. There are images there. So many people will say, well, this dream is, befuddling to me or frightening to me or makes no sense to me. That may be true, but it's still some aspect of you. It's still a byproduct of you. And so we always start in therapy by asking the person to read the dream. I ask folks to write them down because they slip away so quickly. Write it down. Read it aloud very slowly. Allow the images to sort of percolate. Let them hang in the air for a while. And then read it a second time. And usually, not always, but usually, that ritual itself begins to open up some associations within the person. Let me just make a kind of silly example. Let's say a person in a dream is at a company picnic and does something foolish or seemingly improbable. They grab someone's hat and step on it, and they think, what a silly, ridiculous dream. It shows that these things mean nothing. Well, upon further investigation, why the company picnic? Why the hat? What lies behind that gesture? It's not random. It has a certain purpose to it. And upon further stirring of associations, one realizes, well, that's the kind of hat my employer wears, and it may reveal, for example, a measure of aggression toward that person, or a measure of animosity or disfavor with that person that maybe they're aware of, maybe they're not. Either way, it's saying there's more energy here than you have addressed before. Or, the chief purpose of dreams is seemingly to process our lives and comment upon it. But specifically, as Jung pointed out, he said many times our dreams are what you might call compensatory. the forces that we have to deal with in daily life pull us in one direction. Well, what happens to the rest of our personality? It's pushed under. So sooner or later, it will begin to show up symptomatically. And one of the ways it can be showing up isn't through our compensatory dreams. So things I deny by day, I may dream at night. Or the things that I'm not paying attention to will show up in the middle of the night, you see. And we also know there are many reported examples, and I've had a couple, where the solution to a puzzle of some kind is being worked on in the unconscious, and it shows up. There have been many scientific discoveries. Kakove's discovery of the benzene molecule, and also it's either Crick or Watson's, the structure of the DNA and so forth. So these the old saying, fortune favors the prepared mind. So you work that ground consciously, but the psyche continues to work on it. That's what's fascinating to me. And it can show up in the most ordinary and domestic ways. I'll give you an example of a dream that was sort of a kind of rejoinder to my ego consciousness. When my last child went off to university, I gave him the usual father talk, and that had to do with recognize there's so many different courses going on and activities here. It's like a smorgasbord. You'll try too much and you wind up doing nothing well, And secondly, I mentioned, well, when you're there, nobody's going to tell you get your paper done on time. The teacher doesn't care at some level. It's something you have to introduce, and so on and so on. It was well-meant advice. At the same time, my son said, yes, Dad, yes. And sure enough, he tells me he's signed up for 5 classes, which was the normal load, apparently. And he's, oh, yes, on top of that, I've decided to study Russian. And I said at the time, oh, that's too much. That's not going to work. Yes, Dad, thank you. So that's it. Next morning, I woke up with a dream that at first I dismissed as silly. But then I began to think about it. In the dream, I'm driving in the driver's seat my children to college, to universities. But they're adults, but they're sitting in these little kiddie chairs in the back seat for the child protection. And that's all the dream was. And I remember thinking in the dream, this is crazy. They're adults and I'm driving them. I suddenly realized your own psyche is telling you, shut up, right? He has to start growing up. He'll find out. And sure enough, about 6 weeks later, he tells me by phone, this was before the internet, and he says, well, I dropped that Russian. It was too much. And I didn't make a big deal about it. I didn't say I told you so, but psyche told me to butt out. Now that's a kind of low-grade level dream, so to speak. And at the same time, it was a profound contradiction of my ego consciousness at the time, because I was, in what I want to say in a benevolent way, trying to manage my son's life, which was not a good thing. It was time for him to have full control of his own, So the point is, these are not random images. There's no such thing as a meaningless dream. It may remain too fragmentary or opaque for us to figure it out, but the more you struggle with it and the more you sit with the images and come back to them a few days later, sometimes things will have percolated upwards and you suddenly say, oh, well, that's the same kind of feeling that I had when X, Y, or Z happened. And then you realize why that dream was activated, because something analogous to that, because dreams communicate by way of metaphor, symbol, and analog. And if you're not able to access that kind of language or modality of approach to reality, it's going to be very off-putting or difficult for you.
In Jungian writing, the idea of soul comes up often. And through discovering your work and just work of other Jungian authors, I found that idea incredibly useful, personally. But I think for some, similar as perhaps dreams, in some way it might feel a bit old-fashioned as a concept, or maybe tied only to religion in some way. So I'm curious, how do you see the concept of the soul, and how might it be relevant for us today?
Well, first of all, we consciously divide different aspects of our being. We talk about the soma, the Greek word, our body. We are bodies. We are biological processes. We also are a thinking animal. So we talk about nous, or our mind, and its cognitive possibilities. And we also talk about our whole perceptual apparatus that we have, and so forth. But you sort of put all that together. You don't have the human being, really. You don't have its essence. And the literal translation of the Greek word psyche is soul. And you'd have to say that what is most impressive and most essential and most central to the human animal is it's a meaning-seeking, meaning-creating creature. We suffer the disconnect from meaning. We literally suffer. And when we have meaning, as Jung said, the smallest of things with meaning is always larger than the largest of things without meaning. And I think we all know the truth of that. And with meaning, you can put up with an awful lot of conflict and suffering and privation because you have a sense of the purposefulness of it. And when you have that sense of meaning with you, then you're able to mobilize courage and endurance. But on the other hand, if what you're doing is soul killing, it just burns you out. And so much of modern life, of life historically, is soul killing, as we know. So you don't have to mystify it simply to say, all right, this is about the fact that I, as an animal, also have a deep need for meaning, for connection, for creative process, and for values in my life. You know, Nietzsche said once, without music, life would be a mistake. Now, that's a classic overstatement, but there's a truth to that we all know, because there's something about music that can touch the soul, move it to tears, that can invigorate it, can stir it in ways, or produce memories and reflections on things. And yet it's just apparently random noises. But it's obviously something more than that. We have an inherent receiving apparatus within us that responds to it.
On this podcast, we basically often explored the theme of growth, basically personal, professional, and challenges which kind of come with that. And I always try to kind of talk with different creatives about, practices or routines they have that can kind of help them on their journey. And it does come to, in some way, for me at least, it comes to being intentional and somehow mindful, in a way we live, the way we work. And I think this actually connects a lot to the themes of also your book, Living an Examined Life, or just the theme of an examined life. So I'm curious, I guess, through your lens, what does it mean, to you to live an examined life?
Well, the phrase comes, of course, from Socrates, who said the unexamined life isn't worth living, and we have to ask why. Maybe I just want to have a good time. Well, okay, go ahead, have a good time, see how that works out for you. But to live an examined life means to question, who am I here, really? You can't trust your first answers. Those will be the familiar responses, the conditioned responses, the avoidant responses. Who am I really? How am I to spend my time on this planet? In service to what values? And if I don't ask those questions, don't think they're not being asked in the unconscious. And I truly believe, because I've seen it over and over and I've experienced it personally, the unconscious has certain intentions for us that may or may not be conscious to us. And when we repeatedly ignore them, that's when we're going to have the depression we were talking about. That's something pressed down. Take it literally for the moment. It's life that wants expression through you, pressed down, and you are unwittingly, perhaps, oppressing that. All of us carry, creative possibilities within us. And I understand there are always external circumstances that have to be navigated. That happens in real life. But, the people that we admire most as creators are people who often worked under grave hardships and yet produced something that was not so much in service to ego consciousness, far from it, but was a service to the whole creative energy within us. If you have a talent or an interest or an enthusiasm, you're here to use it. And it doesn't have to be grandiose. It doesn't have to be recognized by others. Simply different ways of looking at the world is already a creative process. So much of the time, our life gets so routinized, habituated, that we live on automatic pilot. I think it was John Keats said once, the poet, habit is the great deadener. And it is. Our chief addiction is, and I define addictions as reflexive anxiety management systems. So routinization is one of our addictions. We get upset if the traffic's heavier than we expected, or the newspaper doesn't arrive on time, or 1,000 minor things produce rather large emotional responses. I think the examined life involves addressing many different tasks in life. What role is fear playing in our life? What role is lack of permission? Because I find most people, even if they are very successful in some areas of their lives, often don't have permission to really address what they want to address. Throughout one's life, when you hear people saying, well, I always want to do this or that. Well, why didn't you? Well, there are always reasons. But in the end, one didn't break through those reasons to step into that possibility. And sooner or later, we have to take risks in life, and hopefully it can be a productive risk. But without risk, nothing new ever occurs. One has to break some old boundaries, so to speak, in order to be a creative person. And one of the things that we need to all recognize is it's safe and acceptable to stay within the received frame. But that's not creativity. It's always about breaking the frame. I remember once seeing Harold Pinter interviewed on a British show, and someone asked him, what makes something dramatic? And he said, well, look, and he reached over and picked up a coffee mug. He said, that's not drama. He said, if as I reach for the mug, I pause, uncomfortably pause, and look at that mug, that's drama. In that moment, I haven't done anything. There's total silence. But drama rises out of that because it's breaking the frame, so to speak, of expectation. And that's part of what has to happen. We all receive influences. We all create on the shoulders of those who've gone before. So there are influences working within us in so many different ways. And at the same time, to break the frame says, but in what way can I approach this from a different angle? Not just to be novel. I don't mean it that way. Because that can produce trivial things, but in a way that somehow reshapes or redefines these things. And that's, in a sense, not necessarily an easy task for the ego, because it means its own understandings may be surpassed or left behind. Change is the nature of nature. And the human ego is a very conservative organ. It wants the same. It wants predictability, it wants control, and understandably. But that can be the deadener of the creative process, which means to open oneself to what wants to happen. And I think most artists will say, I set out maybe with this intention, but this happened along the way. I don't care if you're a painter, a musician, or a writer, or whatever. And that's true of anyone in design as well. You start off with a certain plan, but then something else happens. And that's usually where the work can take a new approach, or, step into something that you could say is original, at least for you as the creator. So, what I'm saying is obvious to those who are in the creative field, but I think all of us face that on a daily basis. That's why I said before, routinization and habituation are part of how our psyche makes the world more predictable and therefore presumably safer. But at the same time, it also is not necessarily leading us in a developmental direction either.
Well, talking about examined life brings to mind your work on midlife. And that's also kind of in some way brought me to your work initially, or something that you call, I guess, second half of life. And I think before reading your books, I saw midlife mostly through kind of perhaps even a cliche of a midlife crisis. You frame it, I think, in a much more broad and meaningful way. So how do you define, this midlife crisis or this stage, and why does it matter?
Yeah, actually, I prefer, and I would say this more strongly today than when I wrote that book about 30 some years ago. Often this happens in one's 30s or 40s, and there's a reason for that. The first half, very loosely, is about ego building. And by that, I don't mean egotism. I mean developing a sense of self-sufficient, to leave one's parents, step out of the world, become a person in a relationship, a person who is earning a living, a person who plays citizenship roles, perhaps becomes a parent, etc. All of these social functions are part of growing up and becoming a member of one's society. But then at some point in one's life, one also has to say, but why am I here? What is this about? Is it simply to be repeating these roles, these scripts, so to speak, that I've received from my family or my culture in perpetuity? And or the psyche is revolted. It produces a depression, or a person has a marital affair, or they find themselves with no energy for that job that they had worked so hard to attain, and so forth. And it was at that moment one goes back to the drawing board. And that's where the question of the second half of life can emerge. And that is to say, but what is the soul wanting of me? We know in some way, what does the society want from me? To become a functional adult, generally speaking, and relatively independent. But what does the soul ask of me? That's a different kind of agenda. And so that opens the issues of meaning. A perfect example of this was published in 1885 by Tolstoy, called The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And Ivan Ilyich is a name like John Johnson. It's meant to be an every person sort of thing. And Ivan lived totally according to the expectations of his society. He went to law school, became a lawyer, and then became a judge, and then became a chief judge, etc. Married the right person, lived in the right neighborhoods, espoused the right religious and political points of view, etc. Everything was flowing pleasantly, smoothly, and predictably. And then one day he has a pain in his side that doesn't go away. And then he goes through the stages of denial and bargaining and so forth and falls into despair. And for the first time in his life then, as he's literally dying, he asks, what if I've lived my life wrongly? Or what if I haven't lived my life? And in his last 3 days, he has conversations about the meaning of his life with an illiterate peasant who's been assigned to take care of him while everybody else goes on about their distracted lives. And why would Tolstoy have published that in 1885 unless he'd seen that already? See, so that person's middle passage, which is what I call it, the middle being between the adolescent passage where you step into ostensible adulthood. And in that adulthood, by the way, you usually are following the rules given to you, or you're trying to get away from them. Either way, you're not uninfluenced by them. In the second half, the summons then is, but how are you to live your life in a way that's consistent with what is wanting to be lived through you? And that's a wholly different agenda. And it becomes a religious and spiritual agenda. I mean, not doctrinally or institutionally, but then issues of purpose, issues of meaning, issues of where you really allocate your energies, they come up in a new way. And it's not tied to midlife chronologically, though it often happens by then, for the simple reason. Let's say by the time you're 40, you will have invested in a relationship, or you will have invested in a career or certain citizenship roles. And you realize they have their pluses and they have their minuses, but there's something still missing in your life, and it's hard to put something on it. That's where the person has the fare, buys the sports car, goes off on an expensive vacation, all of which are understandable treatment plans for something amiss within. And the real question, though, is what is my journey about, and how am I to live it? So I think that's something that happens to all of us if we live long enough. Now, sometimes people's, as it happened with Ivan Ilyich, don't face this until they're on their deathbed, or they've lost their spouse, or they're facing serious illness, or their children have left. They suddenly realize how much their well-being and daily structure depended on the relationship with their children. Or when we had the sequestering from COVID throughout much of the world, many people, for the first time realized how much they were depending on their work structure to carry their psychic life. And some people developed new creative outlets in their journeys, and their journeys often had to be at home, for example, and others fell apart. And so those are the kind of crises of identity. They're really crises of identity and crises of scripts. What marching orders are you following now? And sometimes to follow the agenda of the soul means that's the marching order, but you don't have a specific agenda. That makes it all the scarier to you, which is why some people never really undertake it. But then something inside of each of us knows and is forlorn and forgotten. And that's not a good thing to happen in one's life.
And how do you advise perhaps even your clients when they're going through that phase, or like what are maybe perhaps some habits or practices people can adopt or embrace to, I guess, help them come through the other side some way?
Well, there are certain questions I ask of them and ask them to learn to ask of themselves. We're constantly arriving at junctures of one kind or another. We have a path that you have to choose. And sometimes it's, the easy choices are clear, this or that. But the difficult ones, it's not at all clear. Do I stay in this relationship? Do I leave the security of my job? I left a tenured university professorship, for example, at Midlife, teaching in the humanities, to retrain in Zurich and become a Jungian analyst. It was an incredible risk. Most of my colleagues thought I'd lost my mind. And I haven't looked back because I knew why I was doing it. But to ask this question, does this path make me larger or does it make me smaller? Psychologically speaking, spiritually speaking. And you know the answer to that question. If you don't, you keep asking it, it will reveal itself. Secondly, when you make a choice or you see a pattern, what is that in service to inside of me? Now, again, don't trust the first response. So those will be the rationalizations to justify anything. But beneath them, what's the real reason? What is it you're avoiding addressing? That's typically the question that opens it up. What is it you're really avoiding here? What will happen if you step into that? But thirdly, in places where you are stuck, and everybody has stuck places at points in their life, you have to ask the question, all right, what's the fear beneath the anxiety? There are stuck places because when we push at them, we wouldn't call them stuck places if we didn't realize this is something I should be doing or need to do or whatever, but for reasons I don't know, I'm not doing. Then you have to say, all right, that's anxiety. It's free-floating, amorphous. I don't know what it is. But inside the anxiety are specific fears. What are the fears? Well, if I do push through in this area, if I address it, this is what's going to happen. Well, first of all, it's probably not going to happen. That's the fears of the child within us. But if it were to happen, what are the resources you would bring to bear? How would you handle that? So underneath might be the fear like, well, I'll be out there alone by myself. Nobody will understand me. Well, I can understand why that could block somebody. But is that acceptable as a governance principle of your life? Is that what's going to dictate everything? Or I'm afraid my partner will leave me. Well, that's unlikely. But if that's the case, it's pretty fragile anyhow, isn't it? And so on. There are questions like that to ask of any choice. What was that in service inside of me? And also when you face hardship, because sooner or later you will have it, then you'd have to say, all right, how now in the face of this situation or these obstacles over which I may have no outer powers, am I to conduct my life? This is a particularly important question as we age and we lose physical capacities or people in our lives that we have depended upon that are not available for whatever reason. And when that happens, then you're thrust back on your own resources. And what is it that brings to you, or is a byproduct of your choices, that brings you depth, personal dignity, and meaning? You know, if you live long enough, you lose all of your outer powers, and you'll be utterly dependent upon, as the character says in Tennessee Williams, depend on the kindness of strangers, so to speak. And you can still be kind. You can still be inquisitive. You can still learn about the things that are going to be new for you. You can still practice certain values that you care about. These are all things within your innate capacity. So in a way, if you ask the right questions, they'll take you to larger places. If you don't, they won't happen, you see. And it's also true in terms of creativity, for example, that you have to recognize there's a place for the unconscious to produce things. If one's on one's proverbial deathbed and still conscious, maybe even still with pain, we're still having dreams. I know that for a fact because I've worked with people on their deathbed. We're still addressing certain questions in our lives. There is still a sense of purposefulness. These are the things that are the life force seeking, your response. And that's again where our creative energies are found. And we all have that. We just have to know that that's there. And that speaks to that question, first of all, awareness, but secondly, permission. Think about, how would I look at this situation differently? What kind of approach feels really right for me? That's how we move to the new, as opposed to staying stuck in the conventional.
I wanted to ask you about a line you've shared. I believe so. It was first in one of your books, but also more recently in your conversation with Dr. Andrew Huberman. And if I'm not mistaken, you've kind of called it your personal motto of sorts, which is shut up, suit up, and show up. So I'm curious, kind of, how do you see or interpret that?
That motto, and everybody who's listening is welcome to steal it, put it on your refrigerator. It'll change your life if you take it seriously. But when I say shut up, remember, I'm speaking to myself, not to somebody else. Shut up says to me, oh, stop whining, so it's not the way you want it to be. Shut up, There are people with real suffering. There are people dying of pain in the hospital just down the street. There are people starving in Gaza. There are people who have no roof over their heads. You don't have a problem. Just shut up, pull up your socks, right? I'm speaking to myself again. Secondly, suit up. That means prepare. Don't expect somebody to come and hand it to you. Do what you have to do to prepare. Pay your dues, Life is difficult. Earn it. If you really earn it, you deserve it. And if you haven't earned it, it's somebody else's work. So pay your dues. And thirdly, show up, not show off. Show up means just go and do your best. I always love the character in one of Beckett's novels when he says, failed, fail again, fail better, right? You'll always wind up failing, but it's the quality of your failing is what points toward the creativity and the enlarging dimension of your life. And so if you just think of that very simple motto, I worked it out for myself. I just happen to share it with other people. And I've actually gotten photographs from folks who have it on their bathrooms or their refrigerators. And, it's just a reminder. Be accountable. That's what makes an adult, not a big body or big roles. It's I'm accountable for my choices, so I better pay attention as to where they're coming from in me, because a lot of my choices are automatic pilot, reflexive responses, and are not really authentic. And secondly, I'm responsible for their consequences. And thirdly, no one's going to fix this for me. I'm it. I have to figure out what is the right path for me and then mobilize the courage to live it. And so much of it does come down to courage to say, and I think the courage can be enhanced by saying, this life that you have has to mean something, and it has to mean it to you. It's not necessarily to someone else. You don't need the validation of others. But it has to feel right for you, because if it isn't, you have tons of internal promptings that tell you that it's not right for you. But we've learned to overrule those. So sooner or later, what is right for you intuitively, and if you manage to live that with respect to the implications for others, of course, again, we're not talking about narcissism here. We're talking about actually a humbling process, because this is not about making the ego feel comfortable. It's about being creative, and creativity always depends on breaking the old eggshells, so to speak. And when you do that, some new energy is always released. The question is, all right, what are you going to do with that energy?
Hey everyone, that's it for this episode. I hope you found it insightful, and if you have enjoyed it, consider sharing it with a friend. The best way to support this podcast and to keep up with the new episodes, our publishing endeavors, and the current and upcoming workshops is to join our newsletter. Also, once a month, you'll get a brief yet inspiration-packed monthly edit, which is always curated by a new creative professional. It's our popular format, curated by creatives for creatives. To join our list, visit creative.voyage/newsletter. That's creative.voyage/newsletter. And lastly, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to this podcast, and you can also give us an honest rating and a review. All these things help a lot to get the show out there and keep it going. Until next time, my friends, take care.